The call came on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, when the birch trees along the highway had gone gold, and the sky was that particular shade of pale that you only get in Ontario right before the cold sets in for good. I was in the middle of a site inspection in Barrie, standing in an unfinished basement with a clipboard and a flashlight, when my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. The number was one I'd saved months ago but hadn't expected to hear from. It was the plumber my brother-in-law had recommended, a man named Roy, who'd been hired to replace the old cast-iron pipes in my mother's house in Aurelia. "Mr. Hennessy," he said, and there was a pause before the next part, the kind of pause that tells you a person is deciding how much to say over the phone. "I think you should drive out here. I found something in the wall cavity behind the utility room. Something you're going to want to see." I asked him what he meant. "I think you should come yourself," he said. "Not a big group, just you." I told him I'd be there in an hour. My mother had passed in February. She was 71, and her heart had given out on a Sunday morning in the kind of ordinary way that still surprises you, even when a person has been unwell for some time. She had made her tea, sat down in the kitchen, and that was that. Her neighbor found her that afternoon when she didn't answer the phone. I had driven up from Barrie in a snowstorm and stood in her kitchen for a long time before I could do much of anything. She had lived in that house in Aurelia for 34 years. It was a brick bungalow on a quiet street near Lake Couchiching, with a garden she kept up until she couldn't anymore, and an old detached garage that leaned slightly to the east and that my father had always meant to straighten before he died, and never did. After he passed, she had stayed on. My sister, who lived out in Kelowna now, had suggested selling it a few times over the years. My mother would change the subject. The house was hers in a way I don't think either of us fully understood until we had to think about what to do with it. I'd been managing the estate for 8 months by the time I called Roy. The paperwork had gone through a lawyer in Aurelia, an older man who had known my mother from the curling club, and the process had been slow in the way that estates tend to be slow when a person has lived somewhere for decades and accumulated the small weight of a whole life. The utility room had been the last thing on the list. The pipes in that part of the house were original, copper gone greenish and soft at the joints, and my brother-in-law had said Roy was the best for that kind of job. Roy's van was in the driveway when I pulled up. He was standing on the front porch, which struck me as odd, because it was cold, maybe 4 degrees, and there was no reason to stand outside unless you didn't want to be inside alone. He was a stocky man in his mid-50s, careful with his words in the way that tradespeople sometimes are when they've spent decades solving other people's problems without making them worse. He shook my hand and didn't say anything right away, which told me more than if he had. "I pulled the drywall in the utility room to get at the main stack," he said as we went inside. "There's a section of the wall cavity behind the shelving unit, the big metal one your mother had bolted to the south wall. When I moved it to get clearance, I saw something that didn't look like it was meant to be there." He stopped in the hallway. "I didn't touch it. That's your business, not mine." We went through the kitchen and down the short hall to the utility room. It smelled of old insulation and the faint mineral smell of corroded pipe. The shelving unit, which had held paint cans and light bulbs and the kind of miscellaneous things a person collects over 30 years, had been pulled away from the wall and set at an angle. Behind where it had stood, there was a gap in the drywall where Roy had cut for access. Inside that gap, sitting on a crossmember between 2 studs, was a metal fireproof box, the kind you buy at a hardware store for documents and small valuables, dark gray with a combination dial on the front. It was not dusty the way something accidentally forgotten would be. It had been placed there deliberately and relatively recently. Roy said, "I'll go check the fittings on the secondary line," and I heard him go down the basement stairs. I stood there for a moment. The furnace kicked on somewhere below me. The neighbor's dog, a retriever my mother had always called Sweetheart through the fence, barked once. The combination. I tried her birthday first. Nothing. I tried mine, my sister's, my father's. Nothing. I stood back and looked around the utility room, at the shelf of old paint, at the row of mason jars she'd used for screws and nails, at the calendar on the wall from a local hardware shop that was still open to February, the month she died. I tried the year they'd bought the house, 1989. The dial turned. Inside the box there were 3 things: a USB drive and a small Ziploc bag. A sealed envelope with my name on it in my mother's handwriting, the careful, slightly forward-leaning cursive she'd used her whole life, the kind of handwriting you learn in school in the 70s and then keep forever, and a second envelope, thicker, unsealed, held shut with a rubber band. I sat on the cold floor of the utility room for a long time before I opened any of it. My mother had left me a letter. It was 4 pages, handwritten, and she had clearly written it more than once. You could tell from the way certain sentences had a settled quality, like words chosen over many drafts. She began by saying that she was sorry to do it this way, and that she had thought about telling me in person many times. She said she had decided that putting it in writing was better because she was not good at saying hard things out loud without crying, and she did not want me to spend the conversation taking care of her feelings instead of understanding what she was trying to tell me. The name she wrote next was one I knew, Kenneth Aldridge. Kenneth Aldridge had been my mother and father's accountant for 22 years. He had handled their taxes, their RRSP contributions, the sale of my father's small woodworking business when his health declined. After my father passed, he had continued managing my mother's accounts. He had been at her funeral. He had shaken my hand in the church basement and said she was one of the good ones. My mother wrote that she had first noticed something was wrong about 3 years before she died, when she went looking for a statement from one of her investment accounts and couldn't find it in the filing system she kept in the den. She called the financial institution directly. The woman she spoke to confirmed that yes, there had been a change in the correspondence address on the account. 2 years prior, it now directed to a post office box in Barrie that my mother had never heard of. She did not write this as if it were a dramatic moment. She wrote it the way she described most things, step by step, the way she used to explain a recipe. First this happened, then this. She called Kenneth's office. He explained that it had been an administrative update to consolidate her statements and that he had meant to mention it. He apologized. She thanked him and asked him to change it back. But she wrote that something had sat wrong with her after that call. She used the phrase, "a cold feeling I couldn't shake," which was the most dramatic thing she wrote in the entire 4 pages. Over the next year and a half, she had gone through her financial records herself. She had not been a bookkeeper. My father had always handled the accounts. But she was organized and she was patient, and she had learned slowly by comparing old statements against tax filings and RRSP contribution receipts that there were discrepancies she couldn't explain. Withdrawals she didn't remember authorizing. A consolidation of accounts that had resulted in her moving funds out of one registered account and into another in a way that didn't match the advice she'd been given, and that had triggered withholding taxes she hadn't expected. The amount she had written down, carefully at the bottom of the 3rd page, with a note saying she was not certain of the exact figure, was somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000, taken over 8 years in small enough increments that she hadn't noticed until she went looking. She wrote that she had told no one. Not me, not my sister, not her friend from church who she talked to about everything else. She wrote that she was embarrassed, though she didn't elaborate on why, except to say that she had trusted him because her husband had trusted him and because it had not occurred to her to question that trust after my father died. She wrote that she had been lonely and that loneliness made a person grateful for continuity, for people who had known your husband and spoke to you with that familiarity, and that she thought that was probably how he had managed it for as long as he had. I sat in my car in her driveway for a long time after I read that. Then I opened the thick envelope. My mother had spent 18 months building a file. It was methodical in a way that stunned me, because I had not known she was capable of it, not because she wasn't intelligent, but because I had never seen her in that mode, that particular quiet persistence. There were printed bank statements with certain lines highlighted in yellow. There were photocopies of tax returns going back 12 years, with handwritten notes in the margins comparing one year to the next. There were emails she had printed, exchanges with Kenneth about her accounts, and beside certain lines she had written small question marks in pencil. There was a single printed page from the Ontario Securities Commission website about how to file a complaint with the phone number circled. She had never made the call. She had written at the end of her letter that she didn't know what the right thing to do was and that she had gone back and forth about it for a long time. She wrote that Kenneth was old now, nearly 80, and that she was not certain what good would come from involving investigators and lawyers and all the disruption that would follow. She wrote that she was also not certain, if she was being honest, that she had the energy for it. She had not been well. Then she wrote, "I think you will know what to do better than I would. You have always been the one who sees things through. Your father always said that about you. I kept this so that whatever you decide, you have what you need to decide it." I drove back to Barrie that evening in the dark. I called my wife from the car, hands-free, and told her the short version. She didn't say much while I was talking. When I finished, she said quietly, "Come home first. We'll read it together." We sat at the kitchen table until past midnight. My wife went through the file the way my mother had gone through the financial statements, carefully, without rushing. She's a nurse, and she has that quality of being able to look at difficult information without flinching. At one point she said she did all of this by herself. She sat with this for a year and a half and didn't say a word to anyone. She set down the paper she was holding. I think that's the saddest thing. I called my sister the next morning. She was in Kelowna, 2 time zones behind me, and she answered sounding like she was just getting her coffee. I told her everything. There was a long silence, and then she said, "How did she know where to look?" I said I didn't know. I think she just started looking and kept going. My sister was quiet again for a moment, then she said she never complained. Not once, even when she must have been terrified. I contacted a lawyer in Toronto, someone a colleague had used for a financial dispute a few years back. She handled securities fraud and investment misconduct cases. I sent her the file by courier on a Friday, and she called me the following Tuesday. "Your mother was thorough," she said. There was something careful in her voice. She may not have known the legal language for what she was documenting, but what she documented is clear. This will need to go to the OSC and possibly to the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit, depending on what comes out of the initial review. She paused. There's also the question of whether there are other clients. In cases like this, there often are. That sentence landed differently than I expected. I had been thinking of it as something done to my mother, something personal, a betrayal of the trust she had extended because she was alone and grieving and had no reason not to trust him. It hadn't occurred to me until that moment that there might be others like her. Other widows, other elderly clients managing accounts they hadn't fully understood since their spouses died. The process that followed took 11 months. I won't describe it in detail because I don't fully understand all of it, and I'd rather not be imprecise about something serious. What I can say is that it was slow and bureaucratic, and there were stretches of weeks where I heard nothing at all. My sister flew in twice. We sat at my mother's kitchen table, which I hadn't had the heart to sell yet, and went through updates from the lawyer with cups of tea going cold in front of us. At one point my sister said, "Mom would have hated all this fuss." She meant it as a comfort. I think it was. Kenneth Aldridge, as it turned out, had been retired from active practice for 2 years by the time all of this came to light. The investigation expanded beyond my mother's case. The outcome involved regulatory sanctions and a civil settlement. I'm not able to say more than that. My mother's estate was partially restituted through a process the lawyer explained to me more than once, in terms I kept having to ask her to restate. The USB drive took me weeks to work up to. I'd borrowed an old laptop from my brother-in-law to open it, half expecting something I wasn't prepared for. What I found was a folder labeled simply with my name and my sister's name side by side, the way she would have labeled a container in the freezer. Inside was a collection of scanned documents she thought we might need. The deed to the house, her will, insurance policies, the warranty information for the furnace. A scan of a letter my father had written her for their anniversary in 2003, a folder of photographs digitized from before my sister and I were born. She had put it all together in case something happened before she could sort things out properly. She had been organized even in that. I sold the house in the spring. It took longer than expected, partly because of the estate process and partly because I kept finding reasons to delay. The last time I walked through it, Roy had already finished the plumbing. New pipes, smooth walls, the utility room patched and painted. He'd asked me before he closed up the wall whether I wanted him to put the metal shelving back the way it was. I said yes. The fireproof box is in my house now, in the closet of our spare room. I kept it because it seemed wrong to throw out the thing she had used to leave me what she needed to leave me. My wife asked once if I wanted to empty it and put it in the garage. I said I wasn't ready yet. I don't know exactly when I'll be ready. Maybe that isn't really the question. What I think about when I think about that utility room is my mother standing in the cold down there with her reading glasses on, pushing the heavy shelving unit out from the wall a little at a time, the way she would have done it, not all at once, carefully, so she didn't hurt herself, placing the box on that cross member, pushing the shelf back, going upstairs and making her tea. She had been managing an irregular heartbeat for 2 years before she died. Her cardiologist had told me that after the fact, gently, as though it was something I might not have known. I hadn't known. I'm not sure she would have told me even if I'd asked directly. She had a way of carrying things that she didn't want to put down on other people. I stood at her grave on a cold Tuesday in March, almost exactly a year after I'd gotten Roy's call. The ground was still half frozen. A crow landed on the stone of the plot beside hers and sat there for a moment before it left. I didn't have a speech. I had been trying to think of what to say the whole drive out, and I still hadn't found it. I said, finally, out loud, I took care of it. The wind came off the lake, the way it always does in Aurelia in March, cutting right through your coat. I stood there a while longer. She had been a quiet woman who kept her own counsel and held things together without making it look like she was holding anything. She had been an organized woman who had never once let us see how much she was managing. Not when my father was dying. Not when she was alone in that house for 12 years after. Not when she discovered what had been taken from her and sat with it in private for a year and a half before deciding what to do. She had trusted me with it because she thought I could see it through. I hope I did it the way she deserved.